Hey everyone, this is Identi3, a podcast all about digital identity and Web3, and it's my pleasure today to be joined by Anders Borg Sundgren. Welcome, Anders.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's great to have you on. You're the CEO of TrueID. So could you tell us, the listeners, a little bit more about yourself and also a little bit about the company that you founded?
Sure. I can start with myself. So I'm a Swede living in Stockholm. I grew up in the north of Sweden. I have a background, I have a business degree from the Stockholm School of Economics. And in the beginning of my career, I spent a lot of time working in advisory roles. I was a management consultant, worked in private equity. And then I came to the conclusion that I really didn't like just being on the side. I wanted to sort of be in a real business, if you will. So I switched and was really lucky to get a job in the Dun& Bradstreet ecosystem. So I worked with Dun& Bradstreet's biggest European partner called Bisnode, and I spent close to 6 years there. It's actually, Bisnode doesn't exist anymore. It's actually been acquired by Dun& Bradstreet now. But it was a really, really good experience with working with data analytics during that time. After that, I did a stint as the CEO of a fintech, and then I founded TrueID.
Fantastic. So it sounded like there was a very kind of a big emphasis on the kind of financial institutions. And of course, what we find is they're often some of the earliest adopters of identity solutions because of compliance issues and things like that. So it sounds like that was your journey as well.
Yeah, so I come from, I mean, a lot of people working with identity come from it from a security perspective, and I come from it from a data perspective. And I realized that when I talk to people that I sometimes have a little bit of a different perspective on what's happening in identity and where the market is going. So I find that sort of the combination of the security aspect and the data aspects to be really interesting. And of course, financial institutions and in general, customers of data analytics companies are really focused on automating data flows and getting those to work sort of API based and doing integrations, doing automated credit decisions, doing automated data updates, automated targeting in sales. And in all of these instances, you really need to be good at data matching, and to do that, you need to be really good at identity. So that's where I'm coming from.
Got it. That's perfect. And can you tell us a little bit or tell me a little bit more about TrueID, Anders?
I founded TrueID around 2 years ago. We're a team now of 10 located in Stockholm, and we have a global ambition with our product. So we've been spending a lot of time building, because doing a trust-based product, you can't really sort of launch something that you just kind of put together with duct tape. It really has to work. So we launched the product during the spring, and we now have our first customers integrated, and we're seeing good traction. And basically what we're doing is we're offering a global reusable identity, a digital identity wallet, where we want to let users build a rich identity and also a high assurance level identity. And we're focusing on, in the beginning, sort of the first version of the product, we're focusing on making sure that people can prove their legal identity and important touch points that they have. And then we're adding attributes over time into the wallet to help people in solving very specific use cases tied to identity.
And congratulations on those early customers. They can often be the hardest ones to obtain.
Yeah, you're very right about that. So I mean, we're starting to see the first pull. We've been pushing and pushing and pushing. You're starting to feel the first pull from the market, and it's a really great experience. I mean, we're not at a situation when we're sort of a completely established player, but it's looking promising.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I think as we get into the conversation, Anders, like I think one of the areas to focus on is because it's where you're at in terms of that go-to-market strategy and finding product market fit. I'm guessing is a large focus for you right now, as it is for us at Doc. So, it'd be interesting to get into that conversation with you and understand a little bit more about your wins and challenges in those areas as we go through. Before we do that, though. You talked a little bit in the intro about some of the kind of importance of digital identity. When did you first realize its importance, and what were you doing at that time?
Well, I think it's a bit special if you're coming from Sweden and you work in an international context or you travel, because we have a national EID solution called BankID that lets Swedes automate a lot of things that are done manually or semi-manually in other markets. It's really, really efficient. Like you have your own reusable identity and you use it when you log on to the bank, when you pay your taxes, when you file an insurance claim, and these days even when you're logging into your a broadband supplier or your TV vendor, or sorry, not, yeah, you know what I mean. And it's a really, really great system, and there's nothing really like it outside of the Nordics and the Baltic states, although there are sort of emerging strong national EID solutions. So there, we definitely, I think all Swedes really sort of have seen the value of having a digital identity that works across touch points, and the reusability is sort of the main driver. So that's one aspect, I think, generally for me. And then the second one, as I talked about before, working with master data management, data analytics, everything is about matching records from different sources, different databases, and building a persistent view. It could be on a person, it could be on a company, and building a rich, persistent view over time, sometimes referred to as a golden record. And the only really way to do that is to have a concept of identity that's stable over time, because it's that identity concept, or what we also would call a persistent identity, that allows you to really kind of do all of the things you want to do from a master data management perspective.
I think one of the things that we'll maybe get into as we go through as well is like I guess we're taking data from different sources to build up these more elaborate, more detailed pictures of somebody is. But I guess that's where you start to get into, while we're all so passionate, or certainly in this podcast, about decentralization, because one of the issues that you might have is where you have these extremely detailed pictures and that data is centrally held somewhere. The risk is potentially quite significant that if that's held, and obviously you can only secure data for so long in a centralized location. Just over time, it probably will get hacked at some point. So I guess that's one of the things to overcome when we're building up these really rich tapestries of information about an individual. Storing those in a secure way is highly important. And I guess that's a big driver for you at TrueID.
The origin story of TrueID is basically a friend of mine asked me, Anders, where's the European bank ID? Because he had built a really good service for Sweden. He wanted to go abroad. And I knew that there wasn't anything like that. But it got me thinking about a project that I'd been doing a few years back when I was working at Bisnode, the Dun& Bradstreet partner. And it was really clear way back. I mean, we're talking about 10 years ago, 5 to 10 years ago, that the future of managing personal identity would have to become decentralized. And the writing was really on the wall when GDPR was created, I would say, because the only way for you to really manage the consent requirements of GDPR is to have the individual person owning their own identity. And there's also a second really big benefit with that when you're talking about data matching, because if you're working with databases and you try to match data from different sources, being sure exactly who's who in the different sources is actually really difficult. That's one of the reasons why these big data brokers and then data vendors exist, because they're really, really good at matching. But even how good they are, having the actual individual itself join in the matching process and sort of say, yes, this is me, this is my record, or this is not my record. There's a completely different order of magnitude in the terms of matching you can do. So if you combine the requirements of integrity and consent with the advantages when it comes to data matching and building a really rich profile, it was really clear to me working in the DNB's ecosystem that the future would have to go in this direction. It kind of made sense for everyone. It was a kind of a win-win-win, if you will, win for the person, win for businesses, and win for society as a whole. But I never really figured out what the entry point could be, because we all know that getting people to take control of something that they currently don't have, I mean, there's a change of behavior there. And then it really struck me during COVID and with that question about European BankID that doing not only sort of identity verification, but actually repeatedly authenticating yourself against services and doing that securely, that's a situation where you are actually in charge and you have to be sort of conceptually, you are the person authenticating yourself. So if you could tie the identity to the process of proving continuously who you are across touch points, and you could kind of get a foothold in a use case where that made sense, then you could kind of start, you have a starting point, and then you could build from there. So that's basically where we started. And I mean, for people working in the reusable identity space, this is no news. I mean, we all kind of came to the same conclusion. It was just my way of getting there, but that's where we started.
And I think one of the challenges then, Anders, is the thing about decentralized identity and or verifiable credentials is there's no shortage of use cases. Like we could probably each rhyme 20 off the top of our heads right now. However, what we've come to find, and even in the reusable identity model, is the business model is not always straightforward. And so often that can be because sometimes the beneficiary of this new technology is often the holder, the individual who might receive a credential from a bank or from a government, and they can then reuse that elsewhere. But of course, they will do not, and I don't think ever will, want to pay for those solutions because they don't today. That's quite a challenge to get them to turn. So in terms of business model, ultimately who pays for all this stuff can be tricky. And so what's the business model of identity? And so I was keen to pick on that with yourself, not least because I've been following you on LinkedIn and I know you're doing fundraising things, and you talked at the start about getting some customers. So I know go-to-market is very a big issue for you right now. Can you tell me, like, how do you think about some of those, what's your like revenue models and what's your go-to-market strategy at TrueID?
Sure. And to be just fundamentally clear, we haven't cracked product market fit in the sense that we have like 1,000 customers paying and we have or that we're break even in terms of our business. So I would say we're still in discovery mode, but we learned a lot of really important things and we started to figure out what works. So we're in a good place and we're seeing things go in the right way. And we've been doing a lot of discovery, talking to a lot of businesses. And in one area where we started, it was an obvious thing that today companies are paying 2 to 5 euros or dollars to do identity verification one-off when they're onboarding a new customer. It's a really painful process for the user. It's costly for the business. It's not an ideal situation at all. And yet we've seen companies making really, really big revenue in this area because of legal requirements, security risk, etc. So we talked to a lot of companies doing this and saying, what if we would cut the cost of this by 90% and you have a solution where you can just integrate with us. You don't need to manage anything. It's a simple OpenID Connect integration. It will take you a few hours so you can just get sort of ready-made users or customers in your system. And we saw initially like the first meeting would be great and then started talking about, okay, but you're doing this in identity wallet. So that means that they need to onboard with you. You have a service, you're currently working with an app. We can come back to that sort of where do you put your wallet? And we already have a solution now. So when we're evaluating changing that, let's have a talk again. So we quickly realized that sort of the one-off situation, although the current system, it's not good at all. A lot of companies kind of, once they did the integration, they don't want to go back. They don't want to redo it again. So one area where we're targeting in the market and where we've seen some interest is in companies that haven't chosen a solution to begin with. And then they can see the value. But where we really shine, where our quality really, where we really make a difference is when we tie the verified identity to a passwordless multi-factor authenticator that's really smooth and simple to use. And we do that in a closed loop. So you have a verified identity tied to an authenticator. You can kind of think of it as a combined ID selfie solution and the Microsoft Authenticator. And that makes a lot of sense for some businesses because they don't only do IDV once for compliance reasons, and really don't care who they're having as a customer. They actually really need to know who's logging in every day, who's signing the agreements, who's accessing the sensitive data, who's verifying transactions. And in those situations, the combination of a high security level with a smooth user experience for repeat authentication, that's where we really fit, and that's where we see the traction now. So those are the use cases. And then the second aspect of this is about the community. So we strongly believe that the only way to win is to have a user base that actually likes our product and that they're using it repeatedly with perhaps a single vendor or a service that they're using frequently, every week ideally. And then they like it, and then they say, perhaps I could use this with another service. So we could actually get the user base to help us to find more business customers. Basically sort of solving the cold start problem and building a network-based business. And then you want to target the community that is working with identity across different vendors in an ecosystem. And we're seeing traction currently clear traction in 2 ecosystems, and then we're seeing sort of an interest in a couple more. One of them it's entrepreneurs and investors and corporate administrators and business administrators that are working with governance and finance and similar for companies. So you might be managing your shareholder registry, you might be managing your board meetings, interactions with your shareholders, buying and selling, and you're doing that in a SaaS product. And in those situations, you typically have a multinational user base. So doing the few countries that have a national EID is not going to be good enough for you. And security is paramount, and there's a compliance need. And that we have a few customers signed, and we're seeing tractions, and we're onboarding new customers going forward. And the second, which is a little bit adjacent, is in the freelancer economy. So people doing remote work. There are a lot of situations where you need to know, you want to do background checks. You want, for compliance reasons, to verify identity. There are tax issues that you need to handle. And consultants remote sometimes manage sensitive data, and they do sensitive work. So you're doing, they're signing NDAs, and then they're accessing sort of sensitive systems. And in those situations, having an authenticator that's tied to identity, if you're never meeting the person, they're sitting in another country, that's a big benefit. So that's also an area where we're seeing traction. And then,
Interesting. Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, please go ahead, Anders. Sorry, I thought you were finished. Please keep going.
I can talk about my business forever.
Oh, it's all good.
Online marketplaces is another area where we're seeing sort of interest, and then there's a couple of more candidates. There's also sort of communities that are currently not managing identity at all that are very exciting, but you know how it is. You're a small company, so now we're still in discovery mode, but we're starting to kind of target our efforts. And once we feel like now we really have a foothold, we're going to go really, really focused on 1 to max 2 communities and kind of prove ourselves, getting that to work, getting the network to really start getting engaged. And then after that, we can scale.
It's interesting when you talk, because we're going through a similar phase as well. And quite often you can see everything line up for you in terms of your solution solves a problem, you can demonstrate a business benefit. But sometimes, like you said at the start, like sometimes it can be too big of a change for the business at the start. And so that can either remove the desire to change at all, or it can slow it down significantly to the point where the sales cycle is so slow that you have to look somewhere else. Like that's not going to work for you. You think, I'll put a pin in that one and come back to it. So that's an interesting thing. We found that as well on our journey. And even it's interesting, trying to look through all these different, sometimes quite different use cases and markets. It's extremely fun and also extremely frustrating as well, because you put a lot of time and effort in, and these are not things that you can just make subtle changes. You typically would have to then really focus on that market sector, test it, maybe building some landing pages, coming up with a specific business proposition as to why they should be interested or why they should care, and spend time doing that, only to realize that it for whatever reason it's not working. So yeah, we found the process hugely enjoyable ourselves, but also also like banging your head off a wall sometimes. So it's fun and frustrating in equal measure.
I can completely, well, I completely agree with that sentiment, or that experience. Um, so there are a couple of things that we have realized, and one of them is that our solution could potentially create some value everywhere. But we need to go find situations where we're creating a lot of value now, and that means typically we're solving a pain. So we want to be focusing on situations where companies are really struggling. And we find that fear is the best driver. So if people, and currently there's, for good reason, I would say, and it's going to get way worse, if people or companies are starting to realize the problems with identity theft and fraud. Compliance has been a really big driver historically, but I think, and especially when it comes to some industries like identity verification in gaming, iGaming, but I think going forward, fraud is going to be the big driver, and AI is going to be the main underlying technology enabling industrial scale fraud. That I think for us, and that's where we're seeing also when we're getting that discussion going with customers, we're it's a much faster sell, and we could actually sort of our solution really solves the problem, not only kind of adds a little bit of benefit.
Yeah, you do need that urgency as well, don't you, in these markets? Like you need a strong urgency to motivate the company buying your solution to get them over the line, because sometimes, I mean, selling people based on security, it being more secure, it can be a tough road. And often, what people buying solutions, it's either I get more features or my bottom line improves or my top line improves. And those are typically good things to focus on. Anders, in your model, who's paying? Because I think there's the cold start problem that often exists within this sector. And just quickly, the cold start problem for those not familiar is that, again, who pays for all of this technology? So you might have someone who's going into a solution, creating these identities, issuing these credentials. And the issue, because you need those entities to exist first, otherwise no credentials exist in the system. But the problem is, like, what's their motivation for issuing these credentials? Because at the moment, in many places, a clear monetization model does not exist. We can promise them things down the road, but ultimately that's the issue that we have. And so with that cold start problem, how are TrueID, who's actually kind of buying your solution? Is it the end user, the holder, or is it the entity or the person issuing and using your wallet?
When it comes to credential and credential issuing, I think there's one business model here when it comes to verifiable credentials, and I think we're probably going to come back to that in this discussion. It's a really fascinating, let's call it paradigm, that we're really waiting for it and eagerly waiting for it to start becoming big. But we chose, and we done that sort of deliberately. We're very pragmatic in our approach, and we decided let's go for credentials that exist today and that have processes today that work. And that's why we chose global identity verification as one credential system. So there are methods today that work and that have a legal protection for verifying your identity. The best solution from a security perspective is the e-passport solution. So we have an agreement with the UN organization called ICAO, that is the standard body for all e-passports. And we read the chip in the passport with the wallet and create a copy of the passport in our wallet, and then the user verifies that it's their identity. First step is to do it with an ID selfie, sort of an AI-driven face match and liveness check. And then the second step, we're also looking at triangulating that data, perhaps with sources like open banking. But we don't think that user, as you said, will ever pay for this solution. We think it's like a credit card. When you're paying with a credit card, you are in effect paying per transaction for the use of this card, but you're doing it by a fee that the shop that you're buying from sort of has to pay for the card and the payment. And we think it's going to be the same with identity on the internet. So the businesses will have to pay, but they will only pay in situations where it makes sense to use the service. And today, this is already happening. It's happening with identity verification, and it's happening also when it comes to multi-factor authentication. So authentication services also cost money, and those are paid for the businesses. And we have created our pricing strategy to fit with those types of costs that companies are currently incurring for authentication. So we're basically using a flat fee model with all you can eat. So you can have an ongoing secure relationship with the user, and you pay a small monthly fee or annual fee to maintain that relationship. And we think that kind of makes sense for everyone, because it's a type of cost that companies are having today. So it's not sort of a new behavior for them. And it doesn't cost the user anything, but it's baked into the whole service that they are consuming.
Yeah, I mean, so I think that's really interesting. I'd like to come back to that as well, because I think that the tools that people use are important as well. Like some people like using wallets and they're comfortable with them, and others not so much. And I think I've also seen that some companies are comfortable passing wallets or different applications onto their user base because maybe they're quite web savvy. We've seen others that are horrified that we might give them another application or an application to download. And so we can maybe come back to the question about how we manage all that data. But going back also to the Swedish BankID, and sorry for kind of jumping about a little bit, Anders, but you spoke a little bit about that. And there's other examples of other kind of national ID. I think Canada seems to be the one that a lot of people kind of hold up as a shining light. Estonia does similar things as well. In terms of Sweden's BankID, it has good points, but also is potentially difficult with regards to managing data integrity. Can you talk a little bit about that, please?
The Swedish BankID was created in a consortium of the big banks, and it's piggybacking on the bank's KYC. So we have a bit of an oligopoly when it comes to the banking sector in Sweden, or we had, I would say, because we've actually, in the last 10 years, we've seen a lot of fintech startups that have taken market share. But we had a monopoly when the consortium was oligopoly when the consortium was founded. And a lot of people think that it's okay. The banks are doing the KYC and then they're sort of managing the identity of the user. That's actually not true. So the secret sauce or the magic of BankID is that we have something called a personal number in Sweden. It's a number that you get when you're born. It's your birth date and then 4 digits, and it's a number that follows you over your life, and it's used in all situations when you're interacting with any kind of government service or regulated service. So it's it works as the tax identification number. It's the number that you will find in the company house records if you're representing a company. It's a number that will be tied to your driving license, to your car ownership, to everything. So it's one number that kind of is you in all databases and systems in Sweden. And what BankID does is that it points to, it's a way to say, I am the holder of this number. I am this person. That's the only thing it does. There's no sort of other backend beneath it than that. And it works wonders when it comes to automating processes, to integrating to systems, to sort of automate decisions, etc. And it creates really good e-government services. So paying taxes in Sweden, you can do it with an SMS because everything is sort of compiled, all the data is sent from your employer, etc. It's really, really good. I mean, of course, the huge drawback, and everybody outside of Sweden will realize this, is that from an integrity perspective, it's absolutely awful. Because with this number, you can track everything about a person. You can track what they pay, sort of where they live, who they're married to, their children, sort of what they're owning. Everything is tied to this one number. And most countries in the world would never accept a system like that because people actually want to have privacy and integrity.
Is that publicly accessible information in Sweden? So could you actually, or is it only, do you mean in terms of you can track, does that mean people that have access, like admin access to these systems that maybe work for government can track, or is that information publicly available somewhere where a private individual could go and spy another private individual and find out what they've been up to?
Theoretically, some of the databases are closed. So there's a positive credit registry tied to this number for everybody in Sweden, and not everybody has access to read it. There are a couple of other, like your medical records are tied to it, and they're not sort of publicly accessible. Then you need to sort of prove who you are to read them. But of course, no system is perfect. So if you know somebody on the inside or you have a friend, you could, with this number, it's very, very easy to check. And it means that, in essence, if you want to know something about a person, it's really, really simple.
Yeah.
And then a lot of the data is actually completely public as well.
Wow.
So
Wow.
all of what everybody's earned, like your wages, what the taxes you pay, that's completely public. And why do we have this in Sweden? Well, I think we have it because we have been for a very long time a high trust society. So people in Sweden trust the government. We never really had any sort of dictatorships like you had in Germany or anything like that. And so people just got used to the system and they saw the benefits of it. And you have to understand that there are huge benefits to this because everything is so simple. You have this one number and it's a key that opens all the locks. So it's really, really practical, but it's also from integrity perspective, really bad. And what's happened in the last few years, which is kind of scary, is that you've seen more and more organized criminals actually using this to map sort of targets. So they're sort of finding out who to rob or who to fraud or commit fraud towards based on data that they can collect in public systems. So there is a growing understanding that there's actually challenges to the system. But this also means that you can't say, okay, BankID is a great system in Sweden, let's just export it to other countries, but that will never work. I mean, it would be a political outrage. And I mean, some countries it's actually sort of illegal to attempt to build a system like this.
And the UK, I know as well, has often pushed back against whether it's a national ID scheme. They've often pushed back very hard on that. But it sounds like there's a lot of benefits there. Anders, do you see a solution to the problems of that information being centrally held and potentially something that can be used to spy on people? Is there a way that you can take some of the benefits so that you obviously clearly derive in Sweden and eliminate some of the issues?
Yes. And first of all, I would say that if we see a sort of a large scale of adoption of one or a couple of decentralized identity ecosystems, the process of managing a decentralized identifier or a DID, that will solve this problem if you do it right. That's a big if, I would say, because there's also challenging in having multiple DIDs, but in theory you could get that to work in these systems. So that's one way to go. We have chosen a pragmatic approach. We have an identity wallet, and we said let's be technology agnostic here. We don't know which future paradigms will sort of be the winners, but we need to solve the problem now. So what we're currently offering in our solution is an identity graph to each and every user. So if you're a user, you create an identity with us in the wallet. All the data is encrypted in the wallet. You have one of the encryption keys on your device, meaning that we cannot read your data, but you get a persistent identifier, sort of a true ID identifier that follows you across over time. And so we have a persistent identifier for you. You're always the same person. And then we create a link ID for every connection you make. So if you have 10 connections with the wallet, they're going to have a persistent identity on you that only they can use, that sort of can't be shared with third parties. And even if there's a hacker that sort of breaks in and kind of get access to this data, this hacker cannot read sort of the content of the connections or the data transfers with the other 9 connections that you have. The advantage with a graph like this is that then you could also start tying more attributes to these specific identity sort of link IDs or link identities. Add specific, like company signing rights could be relevant in one instance or some other attribute in another instance. So this identity graph solves the problem with integrity, and it does it in a scalable way with technology that works today and where people don't have to sort of adopt a decentralized identity ecosystem in order to make it work. That said, our wallet can also, of course, store DIDs as well. So VCs and DIDs. So we're not against sort of this hopeful future decentralized identity development. We just said we need to solve the problem now with technology that we have today. We can't wait for an ecosystem to sort of win out before we can launch our product.
Excellent. Yeah, and so that pragmatic approach that you've taken that you mentioned earlier. The public is the link ID that you mentioned that would enable, I guess, individuals or entities the ability to maybe share information with the identifier. Is that like a public? Should I think about that in the same way that I'm thinking about public and private keys? I'm thinking that link identity is a public identity that's shared, and that only the individual with also the corresponding private part, the private key to that identity, can actually then make claims or statements. Is that the right way to think about it?
Yes. So conceptually, that's exactly the right way to think about it. And more sort of very simply put, you could think about it as if you're a business and you have a data repository of your customers, you might have a customer ID in your CRM, for example, and you could tie a one-to-one link between your customer ID and your CRM to this ID that you're getting from us that is tied to a persistent identity. And that link, if you're having really high quality data in your CRM, that's sort of kind of a link that's maintained. The really big advantage comes with our service is that if you're establishing a relationship between a user and a business, you also get access to an API where you can continuously update data from the user as long as the user consents to this. So you can sort of, if the user is changing their address or there's something else that's email address, etc., you can automatically pull this data from the user via the TrueID API and using the key infrastructure to make sure that this is done securely. And a second order benefit is if you're a bigger company, like a lot of big companies have, they actually don't have one repository where all of the customer data is stored. They have a lot of different systems. They have poor quality in them. They have kind of shitty identifiers that they use. So they would use an email address as an identifier, which we all know is not a great solution. And they really have a hard time getting these systems to talk to each other. So if you would use TrueID as an authenticator to log in across these different systems with the user, with the business, you could actually tie all of these identities and kind of build a master data management solution from the outside using the user as the key. So that's one of the sort of the dream scenarios for us, or the sort of a nirvana state for us, is a large enterprise using us as an authenticator to really kind of manage master data management in a scalable and very, very simple and automated way.
Yeah, and it sounds like it makes it much more portable and helps overcome some of the data siloing that you explained that not only exists between companies but also within companies as well.
Right.
You spoke a lot about the persistent identifier there, Anders. Obviously, I spoke a little bit earlier on, as I tend to do because of what we do at Doc, but obviously verifiable credentials. So once you have the identifier, then you can actually make claims about or to that identifier, and that's obviously where some of this technology really starts to get very powerful. What's your own interest in verifiable credentials, and where are you seeing the kind of the benefits and use cases for that technology?
I think the future has to include verifiable credentials, and I think conceptually there are credentials that even if they're not sort of using the technology. That when we think about verifiable credentials, we think about it as a technology, and we think about it as sort of a process. And we have processes today, as I said, for example, the e-passport, where you have a centralized registry where all of the passports that have been issued are actually sort of listed, and there are revocation lists, etc. That system kind of works like the way you would set up a verifiable credential system. So there are some instances where these systems with sort of perhaps an older technology are used today. But I think if you can get verifiable credentials the way we talk about it in the decentralized identity space to really take a foothold, you're going to have that system at scale and for pretty much any important attribute. And for us who want to build a rich identity with many attributes and see the value of our service and kind of letting a user kind of pick and choose about which attributes to share with different businesses or different counterparts, and doing that sort of in a smooth way. The verifiable credential is if we get that to work, it's going to be fantastic. And as you said, we talk a lot about identity persistence because we see that it's really important. But you can, with the combination of a persistent identity and a verifiable credential system, you can kind of get the best of two worlds, because you can get, in some instances, you can let a person show that they have had the same verifiable credential over time across a lot of different touch points. You could actually sort of score an identity based on the persistence. Whereas in other situations, the VC framework allows you to only do a one-off data send and then forget about everything. So in some instances, you don't want to have any history. And in some instances, you want to have all of the history, and you can do both with this system, which I think is really, really great. So I'm really rooting for you guys who are kind of building this infrastructure and making it work at scale. And we're very eagerly sort of waiting for the first really big adoptions to take place.
Yeah, and hopefully I think we'll start to see that. I mean, there's certainly been some signs, obviously with the eIDAS stuff taking place in Europe around the digital identity wallets. I think we also see it with LinkedIn, although it's kind of hard to know, obviously owned by Microsoft, and potentially starting to issue credentials out to LinkedIn using, I think it's Microsoft Entra Verified ID. And there's a few other things happening as well. So hopefully we are starting to see things move more quickly in the market. But thanks for your support as well, Anders. I mentioned earlier on talking about, just coming back to an earlier point on, once they've got these credentials and identities, what do we do with them? And so a wallet is obviously what people talk about, but there's many different forms of wallets. Things like having as a separate application can give you a lot, maybe more security, but there's potentially more UX friction there. You need to go and download it. What happens if you lose your phone, etc.? Have you backed it up? So there's that. And the other middle ground maybe you can have is also like a web wallet or a cloud wallet, where you have something that's potentially stored, maybe access it with an internet browser that doesn't require the friction of a download, but then is maybe a little bit harder to secure as well. But you sometimes get some of the same features in a way that maybe some users find more familiar. What's your place with that? Like with Truid, are you thinking purely application-based wallet, web wallet also? How do you think about that?
A great question. I just wanted to say about VCs before I forget. You talked earlier about sort of where you would see traction. I've been talking to several potential customers that really want the system to work, and especially in the freelancing sector, having verifiable credentials about your past work assignments, your diplomas, etc. There's a lot of scamming going on, a lot of fraud. So there are companies that really want this to happen. I think the challenge is to get the issuers to kind of agree on a format. Coming back to the question about wallets, and sort of cloud-based versus device-based. So I have a very strong opinion about this, and I think that purely device-based wallets, it's not the way to go. And the reason is what you said about losing your phone. I mean, recoverability. We've seen this in crypto with people having a lot of money, and then they lose the device. It could be a USB stick or a phone, and they lose all of their assets. And if you're looking at identity, it has to be a system that works for most people. And then losing your identity because you're losing your phone, it's a horrible, I think, situation. So I don't think if you want to have mass adoption, that is ever going to be a viable solution. And we've opted for a cloud-based wallet. And that said, because we're targeting, we're saying to companies, let's forget about the trade-off between user experience and security. So yes, you need to onboard. So there needs to be a situation where the user does sort of the pain of onboarding once, but after that, we want to have the UX being super smooth. It's going to be super simple. And the only way to do that with a multi-factor authentication access to the wallet is to go via a secure device today. And that's why we have an app today, because you want to be able to use device biometrics. It wants to be sort of tied to the phone that people are carrying around. Of course, we're using PIN code, etc. So we're doing several factors, and we can also use other ways of further adding further authenticators to access the wallet. But and we haven't built out all technical functionality that we could have tied to this. But I think if you have a cloud-based wallet, then you can start tiering. So you could say, okay, in these situations, you need to bring up your app to access the wallet because this is a high security one. But you could also have in parallel with that a web plugin in your browser for low security cases, meaning that you can do sort of, it could be sort of the next generation password manager. And even more importantly, I would say going forward, we're not going to see, I think, the phone being the primal device, the prime device it is today. I think we're going to see much more other types of wearables. And so if you can have another wearable, you can get the same authentication, multi-factor authentication quality you get from a phone, but you can get it from a ring or a wristband or whatever. So I think from that perspective as well, to have a cloud-based wallet, I think is in combination with some sort of token or a physical asset that you have and that just tied to you in one way or another, that's the way to go. Because I do think you need to do both security and simplicity to get really mass adoption.
Final question then, because I know we're running out of time. I'm kind of want to be conscious of the time that you're spending with us. My final question then is really about another question that we tend to obsess about is within our field at least is centralized identity management or centralization versus decentralization, specifically towards ID management. So with centralized systems that we're using today, you get many of the, the benefits of, they've had years to build it into a good user experience, but massive trade-offs in terms of who's controlling your data. Ultimately, it's the corporations, how that data is used, things like that. And then you get on the other end of the spectrum, decentralized identity management, where it's down to the individual. But the trade-offs there, like we just mentioned with the wallet, is what happens if you use the device? Do you back it up? Are you managing all of that stuff yourself? What's the user experience like, etc.? So where do you, I kind of probably can guess where you sit in this discussion, but how do you think about the centralized identity management versus decentralized?
Well, if you look at it from an orthodox self-sovereign identity perspective, you would sort of frown a bit at our solution because we are actually managing the relationship with the user, and we're making sure that they are maintaining a persistent identity over time within our software. We have a more pragmatic approach to this, and basically saying that today, before we have an actual ecosystem that works, the only way to get it to work for users and businesses and actually get some sort of initial adoption is to kind of tie all of the things together in the ecosystem so you can bring the whole platform to the relationship building between users and businesses. And if we're seeing large-scale adoption of more decentralized systems, then we could opt for focusing on one part of this ecosystem as our value creation. And depending on where we see sort of that our value is the biggest, then we can sort of say, okay, this is now we have all of this, but we're focusing on the wallet side here, or we're focusing on the data matching side, or whatever it might be. But we're not there yet. I mean, so it's going to take time. And so from our perspective, we like the underlying idea behind self-sovereign identity, but we think that it's a bit, as a concept, it's hard to get there from sort of without sort of moving through steps. And one of these steps is the one that we have chosen, which we think is the right one. And we're sort of compensating, if you will, for our role in this ecosystem by making sure that we have a pledge towards our users that we don't read their data. So we're encrypting the data, and they get the data encrypted with a key on their device, meaning that we can't access it. If they need our help to sort of figure out something about it, they need to give us access. So we are, in terms of their data, we would be a connection just like anybody else, sort of requesting access to their vault so that we can help them out in whatever need that would be. So that's one aspect of answering your question. And then I think the second one is the alternative today is basically giving up everything all the control you have about your identity to one of the really big data hoarders, sort of the giants of Google and Facebook, who create a walled ecosystem where they own everything about you. They control not only your data, but also your access, and they can shut you out if they don't like what you're doing or what you're saying. And in that situation, there's like the balance of power is so skewed that it's just not really, I think, long-term sustainable system. And we want to give both businesses and consumers and users and people a way out of that. Kind of getting the benefits of a social login, for example, like sign up with Google. So the same user experience you could get with our solution, but without having to give away all the metadata that you have about your web behavior, your browsing behavior, or the businesses that you're interacting with to Google, in order to get sort of that small win in UX.
Thank you for that. So it sounds like a kind of hybrid step. So I guess the way that you're seeing it is the self-sovereign is the end goal, if you like, and your solution is probably a good step forward in that direction, but not a full step in the other camp, because there's a concern that users will make that journey with you in a short frame of time. It's more likely that you're on a journey with them and you're making these baby steps towards that solution. So it sounds like you're trying to give the best of both worlds, moving away from centralized, but on the journey towards being decentralized. So hopefully that summarizes what you just said much better than I did.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think it has to be a stepwise approach, because currently the way the internet works, it's really on the opposite side of the spectrum. And in that situation, you need to start building sort of an end-to-end process that works. Once you do that, then you get sort of more adoption towards the future wanted state, then you can start focusing on one specific part of this ecosystem, and that's what our bet is. I mean, nobody knows, right? But that's what we're trying. Yeah, exactly.
It's part of the fun, isn't it? But yeah, again, another indication of your kind of pragmatic approach. I think, Anders, that's certainly what's come across to me on this call. But I think that's all we have time for. Anders, I really very much appreciate your time, for coming on, for giving your perspectives on wallets and identity and credentials, letting us know what you've been working on at TrueID as well. So thanks again for your time, and we look forward to getting you on Identity 3 again soon. So thanks again.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this.